Hello everyone, and welcome to Judy's Creations in Crochet. Today is going to be a little bit different, but before we get started, I want to welcome everybody that has joined me today. And today will not follow the usual format. But before I get started, I guess I want to encourage you all to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and when you subscribe, hit the bell beside it and click all so you get all of the videos I put out. I don't put a lot out. And please comment. I really, really welcome your comments. I like to get to know my followers. So even if you just say hello and tell me where you're from is fine. So as you know, today, I told you last week, we're going to talk about cross stitch. Totally away from crochet, even though this is a crochet channel. Once in a while, I like to do something different. I'm not going to talk about what I am wearing today. This is something I showed you about 2 weeks ago. If you check back to the Jazzy Barista, where I did it in three different fibers, you'll see better pictures of this and a description of what I used and so on. No, we're going to jump right into what I have planned for today because I have a feeling it's going to take a bit of time. I want to start by telling you how I got into cross stitch and my involvement with cross stitch over the years. Then I want to show you what cross stitch is, in other words, the tools and materials that you use. I'm going to then, I will show you obviously some samples of my cross stitch, and I'm going to take you on a walking tour through my home. Not that you will see my entire home, it's not ready for company, but I will show you some of the places in my home where I have a bunch of cross stitch hanging on the walls and tell you a little bit about some of those pictures, and then we'll come back here and I'll show you a little more cross stitch. Now I have gone through the house and tested the lighting in each room. The lighting in any of my other rooms is not near what it is in this room. One day I'll explain the lighting I have here. But I can't carry the lights with me. It's enough that I will have to carry my iPad to videotape what we're looking at. So I apologize ahead of time if the lighting is not as good as usual and if it's a little bit shaky because sometimes I will be holding it with one hand and demonstrating something with the other hand. But I'll do the best I can. So first of all, how I got involved in cross stitch and the part it has played in my life. It was the fall of '79 when I attended my very first, it was a Creative Circle home party. And Creative Circle was a company that, like Tupperware, encouraged home parties with a magazine carrying all of the needlework that they sold at the parties. And they carried a wide cross section, things like needlepoint, crewel. Um, they had, I showed you one at Christmas, something they called Stitch and Stuff. That was one of my Christmas pictures. And of course, they carried cross stitch. And I had never seen or heard of cross stitch before I came to this party. And I, of course, wanted to try it. I bought a kit and I was hooked. Now, before I continue, I want to say something about cross stitch. There are two types of cross stitch, and I'll get into detail more. But there is something called stamped cross stitch, which, unknowns to me, my mother had been doing all my life. But I thought it was just called needlework and or embroidery. That's what I called it when I was growing up, embroidery. And there is also what is called counted cross stitch. And when I talk about cross stitch, that's what I'm talking about. And that's what most people are referring to is counted cross stitch. Um, and I'll get into that in a bit. So I got my first kit. I was hooked, and I continued to cross stitch over the years. But it was always at the beginning buying kits and just doing what was in the kit with the yarn, not yarn, not crochet, with the threads or floss as it was called, with the floss and material and pattern that was provided. And it wasn't until into, say, the early to mid 90s that I discovered ways to actually buy all the parts separately, which in the end is usually more reasonable. And then, a long story I won't tell, it was by a real fluke that I eventually opened up my own cross stitch store. And I opened the store in the summer of 97. And it was a brick and mortar store in an actual house, a 1920s house that was a block or two off the main drag. And I sold patterns, material, kits, floss, and all the extra things that you need to cross stitch. And eventually I branched out into a little bit of needlepoint canvas, and I was there for 5.5 years. And then economy in our city did a belly flop. One of our largest employers in the manufacturing industry, who had about 1,000 or 1,100 employees, pulled out of Chatham and went south. And of course, that threw everything haywire. All kinds of offshoot industries and everything were affected. And of course, I was not a necessity, so it affected my business too. So in order to continue to offer this, because that was my main thing, was to offer cross stitch to people who, until my store was here, had never seen the variety that I had never seen fabric like I carried. So I was encouraged by both my neighbors to bring the business into my home. And this room I am sitting in now was actually my store, along with the hallway outside where I carried a lot of my materials. And so I brought the business home for another, maybe 5.5 years. Things slowed down, of course. And then shortly after that, I retired, and I didn't like being held down to regular business hours. I wanted to be able to come and go as I wanted. So I shut down completely and went completely out of the business, but continued to cross stitch because cross stitch was my passion. I've tried many, many, many crafts over the years, and cross stitch was always my favorite. I am Now it ties with crochet because, of course, crochet came back into my life about, I'm going to say 6 years ago. So that's my involvement with cross stitch. Now, to distinguish between the two types, stamped cross stitch, the type my mother did, was you bought a transfer and you had some fabric. In our case at home, we had pillowcases. Then my mother ironed on the pattern, which was a transfer, ironed it on to the end of the pillowcases. And then she used floss, of course, to do the X's that were stamped onto the pillowcase. And usually she used a variegated one color monotone and did the whole thing like that. Now, embroidery really has more than cross stitches in it. Embroidery would have, like satin stitches and leaf stitches and a lot of other stitches in it. She only did X's and a little bit of back stitch, and then she would actually crochet a very fine lace around the edge of the pillowcase. And you can still get stamped cross-stitch different places. And I've seen other versions of stamped cross-stitch. Even when I was in business, I saw where you could buy patterns of embroidery or stamped cross-stitch. And then people started to actually stamp it somehow onto the fabric so that you bought it stamped on, and even had the lines to outline what you did where. All of that I call something else, but counted cross stitch involves having a fabric. Now I'm going to show you some of the pieces. Having a fabric in the beginning, many beginners and learners would use something called Aida, A-I-D-A. And I don't actually have any Aida left because I got rid of all my fabrics, but I'm hoping you can see the material in this picture. And I'm only going to show you the corner of the picture for now. I have to figure out where my camera is. Okay. And if you see up close, you can see the little squares in the fabric. And the squares are what you used to make your X's. They made the perfect X going from corner to corner where you see the holes. That is Aida. And then you would get a pattern. You could buy a pattern in sort of like a kit where you have the picture and you turn it around, and there is the key that tells you the symbols you will use and the color of floss. And this is done with DMC, DMC being the most popular floss, although some will argue that Anchor is better known, and there's also JP Coats. But I believe that DMC outsold all the rest. So there's the key. So you would know when you bought this pattern what threads you needed to purchase also. And then I won't open that one. I'll open this one. This came out of a magazine, and this is the picture being cross-stitched. You can see it's a lot of black, but when you open it up, you have a graph. And in this case, the key is over here. This was a very popular magazine. The key is over here with the different symbols, and this company gives both Anchor and DMC along with the name of the color and the code. And you see there's a code for every stitch. And then you go over here. For example, all those black dots are, if you look over here, they are black. 310 in DMC is black. And then there are other colors in the flowers, so there are other codes in the flowers. The straight lines over here are what's called back stitching. So there's the black back stitching, and there's green for the vines in the flowers. So see the black that the notes are on, and then the green over here. And this is what a pattern typically looks like. It is a graph or a chart. So you have to count from, say, the center or the corner, how many stitches to the first stitch, and then you count, okay, 2 stitches, the next row has 4 stitches, and so on and so on. All right? And that's what counted cross stitch is. You can buy a chart pack, they call it, or you can buy a magazine with lots of things in it. You can buy a leaflet. You can buy a book that has many patterns in it. And some of the patterns will even go so far, here's one, that the pattern, this is a part of it, is printed in color. So over here, it has a color and a symbol in it with the proper color, and then down here it's done in color. You don't see this a lot. It's not as common because printing in color is quite expensive, as I'm sure you know. It's expensive to buy colored ink for our printers, but that's another way they are printed. But again, it is a graph, and you see the marks on the lines. That's to mark every 10 in the pattern. And if you follow it properly, it has a way to find the middle of the pattern and the middle of your fabric. And generally people start from the middle and work out. Now I have a couple of pictures here to show you real quick before we start our little trip through the house. And this is one of the very first ones I did. And we'll have a discussion as we go about glass. Ah, you can tell that's got glass on it. So let me get it up closer. This is one of the first early ones I did. Not the first, but early. All my first ones are gone. But I love this because this was a sewing room, and I thought, I don't really quilt, but boy, this says something about my sewing room. I'm into everything. And there was a cat in the lap, and I changed the cat to look a little bit like, very poorly, but sort of resemble my very first cat, Missy. She's long gone now, but she was my very first and my sweetheart. So that's done on Ada as well. And I'll be talking about changing fabric later. But in the early days, that's all I knew, Ada. And then the other picture I had in my hand, this is a picture that's in my kitchen, and I found that the lighting in my kitchen was terrible, so I brought this one down. Again, very early days, it was under glass, done in Ada, and once again, I changed the cat. I had a calico cat, so I put this one into calico. Her name was Muffy. So quite a variety of things going on there. And you could get Ada eventually in, like I said, the early 90s. I learned of a store that was in Grand Rapids. Now that's in Michigan, but I can cross over to Michigan an hour from my home, and then it was another, I think, 2 hours or so to Grand Rapids from Detroit. And here is one done on, now we have no glass. This is one done on green. Green a little harder to see. Black harder, just like crochet. People don't like crocheting with black yarn. I don't find black yarn a problem, but black fabric was hard to work on. And here's one last one, just to show you something different. Still done on Ada, but again, no glass on this. You can see the Ada. But this one is done, I think you can tell, with lots of beads. Beads in the flowers, beads in the dove. And it's a little wrinkly. It wasn't mounted the best. Now, I eventually, just before I opened my store, I discovered something called even weave. In Europe, a lot of people start right away stitching on linen. And by the way, I think that cross stitch is very, very common in the United Kingdom. This comes from a company in the UK, but over there, when they make this, they sell it only as a kit. But they learned very quickly that over here in North America, the consumer did not want kits. They want to buy the pattern and then their own fabric and threads to make it. So that's why it says chart only, to keep it separate. So it was coming to North America. And Zweigart there is in Germany, and they're a company that make the fabrics that we stitch on. They're the biggest. There are a few others, but that is the biggest one, and they have also an outlet in the US. But I think Holland is very, very, cross stitch is very popular. But then I learned about even weave. I happened to go to Grand Rapids. I saw that green fabric, but I also saw other fabrics. And when I would make orders, they would always be encouraging me to try linen. And I was afraid of linen because instead of having squares, it was woven with threads that were woven evenly. And you had to equate Ada, and that everything I showed you was what's called 14 count. That means 14 squares in an inch. I know we're all metric now, but that's the case. It was 14 squares to the inch. And so I stitched on what was called 14 count Aida. But when you bought the fine linens or other even weaves, it was 28 threads to the inch, and you had to go over 2 threads each direction to make the stitch equal to your 14 count. And I will show you many of those upstairs. And once I learned how to do that, I never went back to Aida, because when you look at this picture, I see squares. I see them. You don't in the other. So now I'm going to have to shut this off so that I can get my iPad out of the stand and move upstairs, and then hopefully we'll be able to navigate without too much problem. Okay, now we're going to see a few more tools used in cross stitch. Just before I start talking about that, I just want to show you a picture here. Now I am working on what's called even weave, and it has texture in the fiber. I think you can see the threads running through it, but you don't see the squares. So back here, this is a floor stand, although I did a lot of my stitching on what was called a lap stand, which is a mini version of this, but it would sit across my lap on the couch or in a chair. Now, what I have done prior to coming up here is to get out a pattern. This is a pattern that was folded all up into a very small square. And this is the pattern itself. It's quite large, as you can see. It's printed large so people can see it well. And in the corner, you see the key that tells you all of the threads you need. And notice that it also says Mill Hill beads. There are beads in this. There are also some metallic threads in this picture. So that's the pattern. You can see big graph, lines going up and down and across, and somewhere, I guess maybe this was the middle that I used to count. Now backing off to see the stand. You don't have to have a large stand like this, but this is a big picture. And I wonder if I have it written on here. I'm using 32 count, which is a little bit smaller, and it looks like the design itself is 14.5 by 17, so that's pretty big. The stand, and of course you need extra fabric for mounting it. So the stand has a tray where I keep, you know, the beads, and all the threads are in here. You can see the needles and so on, and that swivels, and it's adjustable. And over here we have another adjustable. This is a rack where you keep your pattern. And I have copied this pattern into sections because there's no way I was going to keep that big thing in front of me. So I split it down, and you'll see up close that I actually use a pencil and I shade in what I have done as I progress most of the time. Now, I'm working on this angel. I have been working on this angel for several years because cross stitch has taken over my life. But I will not be putting those wings in. So now let's see the actual front here. I'll turn it around. And here is the picture that I'm doing. And I really like it because of the pinks and greens that really match well in this room. So here is the work I have done so far. I've done a fair bit of pinks, got her face and everything done, and starting to do the green into her dress. There is going to be a lot of white when I get farther down. See the bottom of the dress, a lot of whites. And there's those dots are either beads or metallic running through it. And the hardest part is going to be these flower clusters, which are similar to the flower cluster that started here. They're more difficult simply because you're changing colors. You know, you do 2 stitches of this and 3 stitches of that. You can see how different colors. That blue that runs through her dress, you can see is a blue metallic thread. So that's something in progress, and I promise myself to get back to it sometime. Maybe it'll be next year, but I do want to get back to it and finish it and get it on the wall so I can enjoy it. Now, leaving this, ignore the mess. Now, I came up here and moved furniture around and got these lights positioned, and the lights are on so that you can see when I get closer. So this is my wall of cross stitch at the end of my living room. And the picture we just looked at is by the same designer as the big one in the middle, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Oh no, I'll keep going. That designer is Marilyn Levitt Inbloom, and she actually was one of the biggest designers I was aware of, and I got that pattern by accident, sight unseen. They sent me this pattern because they told me it had the colors I liked. But she had 3 lines of cross stitch, and the big one, which we'll look at closer in a minute, is called Lavender and Lace line. Then she had a line called Told in the Garden, and let's look at this one. This one is part of that line. Told in the Garden were all of her patterns that were centered around the Amish and quilts. And the quilt at the far left with the blue and pink is one I designed because I didn't like the colors that were in it. And I designed one other, I can't remember which. It might be the one just to the right of the lady that has the black and blues in it. So that is her line called Told in the Garden. This is her line called Lavender and Lace, and I want to point out a few things about this one. First of all, can you see it's done on a sparkly material? And this is the actual pattern that I bought, the picture of the original. It's not focusing, probably because I'm wiggling. But you can see it's done on a darker fabric, and there's a lot of dark stitching in the upper corner, and I didn't care for it. So I simply left it out and stitched it this way. And I think it's absolutely lovely. A mistake turned out beautiful. Now those strings are beads, and anything that stands out, like the silver here, and in here is a pink metallic. I thought there was another metallic. I think, yes, there's an opal metallic going through the white, which is hard to see. But it's a metallic thread, is a little heavier than floss. And then the beads. And then finally, as I mentioned, you're stitching over 2 threads, 2 threads. But she's known for detail like that face. It looks like a photo. And that is done by stitching with 1 strand of floss over 1 thread each way. It's very tiny. I don't know what that lock is, but it seems to be locking the, there you go. See the beauty of that face. Okay, moving on. Beside it, here is something stitched on black. So it's very difficult to see. And in the center, that butterfly is done with what's called half stitches. Much daintier. Then over here, I have something again on black, and this is done with, oh, that's focusing good. Notice that the stitches are sort of like an ombre effect going from pale blue to pale pink and so on, and then in the teal. They are hand-dyed threads, hand-dyed flosses, silk probably, and again on black. And then the silver that you see is not just a metallic, it's actually almost like wire, very, very fine wire that you stitch with. Then going above it, we have what's called a sampler, and you won't see too much X. There is a little bit of cross stitch in it, but most of it is fancy stitches. Once you get pretty good at cross stitch, they have patterns with extra kinds of stitches, much like embroidery idea. Now this is a particular sampler that I taught online. It's called an e-class, and it was a limited edition. You could only get this pattern by signing up for the class, and I agreed to teach this e-class, and the people in it would meet with me. This is back in the day when we didn't have internet, so I had to type it all up and put it on and show pictures of what was happening. And one of the people in my class was a gentleman who was involved in the Embroidery Guild in Chatham, Massachusetts. And I thought it was so funny for somebody from Chatham in Massachusetts to be taking a lesson from Chatham, Ontario. But those are all specialty stitches, and I learned a lot doing that, stitches I had never done before. And on that same vein, over on the other side, we have another one. And this has, hopefully there it is, this has satin stitches, again in a silk floss around the outside. Then the flowers are cross stitch, and the center is what's called hardanger. Notice, I think you can tell, that has been cut out. You stitch in such a way to be able to cut certain threads. You have to do the right ones or you have a great big mess in a hole. But that's called hardanger, and that is very, very common in, I think it's Norway. It's one of the Scandinavian countries, but I think it's Norway. It might be Denmark. Anyhow, that is hardanger, and I grew to love that, the gorgeous samplers you could do with that. Now, moving into the hallway here, you see some cross stitch, and I have to turn the light on, but it is fairly good. This is also another one by Marilyn Levitt in Bloom, and I told you she had a line called Lavender and Lace and Told in the Garden. This was her third line called Butternut Road, and this was one of the first. This was the first picture I finished on even weave. I started another picture I'll show you later, but I never finished it at the time. I finished this, and this is one of my favorite pictures. Just love it. And down below we have a little bell pull, again done in black and in colors that go in my living room. And now turning the other way, we have the wall of cross stitch. And when you look at that wall of cross stitch, you can tell which one has glass on it right away. And you'll notice that I do not put glass on my pictures anymore. Once I opened the store, sorry for the wiggling, once I opened the store, I started to learn a lot. And one of the things I learned is pictures under glass tend to, what's the word I want? Erode. Apparently, putting glass up against the picture causes the fabric to deteriorate over time. Now, it could not, maybe it wouldn't be in my lifetime, but I hope somebody after me is going to love my pictures. This is not focusing. Hopefully it will when I get closer. Air is trapped in there, and air changes temperatures in your house. It goes from warm to cool. And of course, in the environment, temperatures are always changing, and it traps the air and moisture gets trapped in there, and it can cause a problem with your fabric over time. So if you want your project to last, you're better off not to put glass on it. The only time I'd put glass on it is if you had a very heavy smoker in the house. So let's go up close and see if it will focus. Okay, there we are. Focusing. Now this again is an older picture. You can kind of see the squares. It's a damask Aida, so it's shiny. And again, I made some changes in the picture. The upper left corner is one block I designed myself. And I think I either designed the one beside it or the one at the bottom. But that was a kit. And I substituted the fabric and did a little design work. Then over here we have a lady from, I think she's from the California area, who designs houses, every kind of house. And this reminded me of a house here in town, and I just really liked it. I have another one of hers I want to do, but I haven't gotten to it. And on the far side, I'll leave the other one, you can see why I did this picture. But I hope you can see the fabric, get real close, is not full of squares and holes. So to me, the picture looks more finished, more professional when it's done on even weaves. And there are many, many varieties of even weave. They aren't all linen. Linen is a little harder to stitch on. And finally, in this area, the Canadian flag. And this is very interesting because the designer is Lynn Nicoletti. Sounds Italian to me. She does live in Ontario, but in having a conversation with her, I know that she is from England somewhere. And I find it interesting, with all the mixed background she must have, that she was designing Canadian patterns. This is one in a series. She did a Canadian penny and a Canadian dime, and she's done loons. But I love this picture because I want to tell you the Canadian flag is white and red, as you know. And that flag there looks like there are other colors. For example, some of you will recognize the Union Jack. And the Union Jack was our flag until, I think it was 1966 or 67, that we adopted this flag. Well, the Union Jack, of course, has blue in it. And that looks like blue. But I want to tell you, I know from stitching it, that those are all just different shades of red. She's done a marvelous job to get the coloring ideas of all the items she wanted to put in this picture with red. You see the Canadian toonie up in the top left. Beside that is a picture of Josiah Henson. He is, if any of you know anything about Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's the same man. He's a black man who is very involved with helping slaves get to freedom and setting up Black communities in our area. We have on the other side of the center, we have the 3-cent stamp. Notice the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell was Canadian. We have a fleur-de-lis. We have things that refer to the Olympics and the winning goal time for the Canadian-Russian game. And finally, the words you can see in Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. And that again is a poem that many know in reference to November the 11th at Armistice Day. And it was a Canadian who wrote that poem. So that is my hallway gallery of pictures. And I'll just step back once more so you can get a better view now that we have a good focus. And now we're going to move upstairs. This is a room that I'm quite proud of. The lighting isn't the best in the world, But this is my bedroom, and I spent many hours. I wanted to show this off when I show you the picture. The wallpaper is absolutely beautiful, but it's full of flowers, and I went looking for years to find a quilt that would match it. And there is the quilt, and I'm absolutely super pleased with it. I looked in Mennonite country here in Canada, and then I finally went on a trip down to Hershey, Pennsylvania for a cross-stitch festival. And when I was there, I went to Lancaster, and I went everywhere to try to find a quilt that would work in this room. And you know, quilts back then, we're talking in 2006, easily $1,000, might be a little less in some places, 800, 900,000 and more. And I found this in an Amish home along the side, in the countryside, and I paid $475 for that quilt, and then the 2 pillows on top of that. Absolutely beautiful quilt, works in my room, and I asked to make sure it was queen size. She said yes, and you'll see here, it turns out that it is king size, but I don't care. It's too big for the bed, but I love it. So in here I have this picture, and I really wanted you to see it. Again, blues for the room. And what I want you to see about this is the pink in her skirt or beads, the navy is beads, and finally the feather in her cap is what's called whisper, and it is, you can see the whispery edges. It is a very fluffy yarn. There is a company that believes if Santa's boots are patent leather, you need patent leather to stitch them. If it's fuzzy, you need fur. You know, they created all kinds of fibers to stitch with, to give amazing looks to the pictures. And over here I have what's called Quilt Magic, and it looks like a quilted piece, but it is a foam backing, and you punch the fabric into the grooves that are cut in the foam background. And then finally in here I have this. Now this is needlepoint, and it is my own design, again to match the room, and that is a log cabin design. And actually I made this quite a bit before I bought that bedspread that has the log cabin squares in it. So how neat is that? And now we're going to go across the hall, so I'll cover the lens for a second. Wanted you to see this. Again is a picture from the lavender and lace design line, and this one I totally changed the colors. She did a whole series of what she called Celtic pictures. She had Celtic spring, summer, winter, and fall. She also had Celtic Christmas. I did the Celtic Christmas. This was, and it had a border around it with Celtic knots and beads. I wasn't crazy for the knots and beads on this one. I did this picture for a dear friend of mine. We spent a fair bit of time together, and her 70th birthday was coming up, and I decided to take one of the pictures and change it to her colors. These were her colors, and before I could finish, before her 70th birthday, she passed away suddenly. So I finished the picture eventually, and I have it, I guess, as a memento of her in my office. Now on to the next room. Here I have quite a few cross stitch. They aren't all pictures that I've done. You saw the 2 Christmas ones at Christmas time. There's the Canadian map, and here, very simple, kitty and puppy. And finally, the picture from the outside edges of the frame is 3 feet. so you know it's fairly large. And this was a frame that I just bought in Walmart or someplace like that, and it happened to work. I guess I could have extended the water a bit, but I was quite happy with the way it was, and I liked it. Gorgeous, fun to work on. This is one of my favorite pictures, and it was a very, very popular design in the store after I did it. And again, you can see a little bit of cross stitch in the flowers. Then in the center, we have sampler type stitches. And finally, once again, we have hardanger top and bottom. Although it's cut out here, it's not cut out at the bottom. And it's in mauves, as you know, one of my favorite colors. And I absolutely love this picture, and I know who's going to get it one day. So I had to show you that because hardanger, I think, is gorgeous. All right, we are back downstairs in my sewing room, my taping room. And I don't know how long this video is going to end up being because I've had to start and stop a few times, so I don't know what the count is. But I do still have a few things I would really like to show you to give you a cross section of cross stitch and the things that can be done. I have a whole binder full of items that I took pictures of and made over the years, and it doesn't even include probably the first 10 years. But here's a picture that I did that was from one of those leaflets with colored squares, but it was the most difficult thing I ever did because the colored squares were very close to the color of the picture, and they all were very close to each other, and I kept losing my place. But I was doing it for somebody that I knew would really love that picture. So that's one I did. That is quite different than the other things you would have seen in my house, because when I do something for somebody, I try to do the kind of thing that is to their taste and not always to my taste. Now, I talked about the three girls, which was the first even weave project I ever finished. But I didn't start with it. I started with this and didn't complete it because it was very hard. This particular picture is the first time I ever stitched on even weave, and it is a bluish color, and it had an awful lot of half and quarter stitches in the picture. For those across stitch, you understand half and quarter. And quarter stitches is one of the reasons why I will never stitch on Aida again, because with Aida, you're puncturing and you cannot find the exact middle of the square. Whereas when you're going over 2 and 2, you just go over 1 for the quarter stitch. This took a lot of work, and I did eventually finish it and give it as a gift to someone a few years later. And I only have 2 more pictures I want to show you here. No, I have 3. This one is, again, an example of hardanger, and I took 2 patterns and put them together. I wanted the hardanger bell pull, but I wanted the words joy. It had particular significance. I was giving this as a retirement gift to our minister, and there's a story behind that. If you want to know, you can ask. And so I designed and put that together, but hardanger allows you to cut out the whole thing without having to hem or do any sewing. And so I love that one. Now, I talked upstairs about the Celtic line, and I did make one Celtic one that was done in the true manner of her patterns. It's a lot of work to do the border because it is full of beads and 2 and 3 stitches of different colors, and that's her Celtic Noel. I actually sold that picture. But the one you saw upstairs was Celtic Fall that I altered. And then I have this set that I will be putting this on the door very soon. Nice spring picture. But it was a set of 4, the 4 seasons. I can pop this out of the frame and put another one in. It's tight, which is a good thing. And I have a fall picture, and the summer one I didn't like, so I won't do it. And I've never gotten around to doing the winter one, but there's the fall one. And very soon, as I said, I will pop this out and put that spring one back in, and I hang it on my door or something like that. So that's just a little bit of the cross stitch I have done over the years. I have been cross stitching, as I said, since 79, and I still love it. I have a new focus right now. I'm loving crocheting and all the beautiful hand-dyed yarns, but there is a lot more to cross stitch than people realize, and I certainly learned a lot while I had the business, and I did classes, and they were very, very popular, especially the class where people learned how to stitch on even weaves instead of Aida. And every single person except one who had trouble with her vision, everybody else agreed with me they would never go back to Aida. They absolutely love the look of the finished project when they use a linen or an even weave. So that finishes up what I have to say about cross stitch and what I have to show you. I mean, I have many, many more examples, but I'm sure this has been way longer than it should have been. So time to say that's it. Next week, not really sure. I do know I will have some FOs to show you, and that'll probably be the focus of next week's video, is some FOs, because next week it will actually be St. Patrick's Day. So hopefully you will join me again, and until then, happy hooking.